Let's jump right in and take a look at Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Two creation stories, right there, side by side in the Bible. Chances are you've read them, but here's what's wild, they don't exactly tell the same story. Now, before you say, wait, isn't this all part of one big seamless narrative? Hold on, let's look closer. In Genesis 1, we have this cosmic, orderly account of creation. It's structured, it's methodical. 6 days, one after the other. First, light is created. Light before the sun, by the way, which is weird. Then the separation of waters, dry land, plants, animals. And finally, on day 6, humanity male and female. It's a God who stands above everything, speaks things into existence, and sees that it's all good. A powerful, transcendent being, creating from a distance. But then, Genesis 2 comes along, and it's like you're suddenly in a different movie. It starts with a barren earth, no plants, no rain, and no people. God steps down from the heavens, gets his hands dirty, literally forms Adam from the dust, and breathes life into him. The God in Genesis 2 is more intimate, hands-on. And then what happens next? God plants a garden, then creates animals, and later, after realizing Adam is alone, makes him from his rib. The whole sequence feels so different. It's personal, almost experimental. And unlike the distant, all the God of Genesis 1 is a powerful, involved, responsive God who figures things out as he goes. So why the difference between this God and the God of Genesis 2? Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 seem to be two different portrayals of God and creation and humanity. Genesis 1 says that man and woman are created together in God's image and are equal. But Genesis 2 says that Adam is made first and Eve comes later, almost like an afterthought. That's a pretty big shift in tone. Scholars have been debating this for centuries. These aren't just two versions of the same story. These are two distinct stories that somehow got mashed together in one book. Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 come from different traditions and were likely written by different groups at different times for different reasons. This makes us question the idea that the Bible is a seamless, flawless narrative. If you've been taught that the Bible is one consistent story from start to finish, these two creation accounts challenge that idea. They suggest something much more complex that doesn't quite fit into the neat little package we've been sold for centuries. These stories weren't just dropped out of heaven, they were written by people with different perspectives and different agendas got together and decided to include both of these accounts in the final text. Now, let's talk about the names. In Genesis 1, the word used for God is Elohim. It's a powerful, commanding title. But here's where it gets interesting, Elohim is actually a plural. The word is plural, but don't assume there were multiple gods. The verb forms in the Hebrew text are singular. Why use a plural word for a singular God? Some scholars argue that this points back to ancient Israelite beliefs. Before they became strictly monotheistic, Elohim might have been a leftover from a time when people believed in many gods but focused on just one. It was kind of like a transition phase in their theology. Think about it. Polytheistic cultures were everywhere in the ancient world. The Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Canaanites, there were gods all over the place. And then, right in the middle of it, the Israelites are carving out this idea of one supreme deity. But the language, the culture, it still carries traces of that earlier polytheistic worldview. Now, fast forward to Genesis 2. The name changes suddenly. It's no longer just Elohim, it's Yahweh Elohim, which is Lord God in most English translations. This isn't just a change in title, it's a change in the entire vibe. Yahweh is personal. It's the covenant name, the name God gives when he's making a promise to his people. So what's the deal with these two names? Why does the Bible use two different terms for God? Well, it might have something to do with the source materials. Genesis 1 is thought to come from a priestly tradition, a group focused on structure, order, and the big cosmic picture. Genesis 2, on the other hand, comes from a different tradition, the Yahweh tradition. These people were all about the personal relationship with God. Yahweh isn't just some distant deity. He's right there in the dirt, forming man from the dust, walking in the garden. This shift in language signals a shift in how God is being portrayed. So, we've got two different traditions, two different names for God, and two different ways of when we look at creation, we see two different portrayals of God. One is Elohim, the God of power, the God of the universe, the God who creates everything with a word. The other is Yahweh, the God who is close, the God who gets involved, who walks with humanity. The Bible presents both of these views side by side, and there's a reason for it. These texts were compiled with a purpose. These two accounts reflect the evolution of how ancient people saw their relationship with the divine. Sometimes God is transcendent, above everything, and other times God is intimate and personal. The two stories and the two names represent different aspects of how humans have understood the divine over time. Let's dive into something even more intriguing, the sources behind these creation accounts. These two stories didn't just pop out of nowhere. They come from different traditions and different voices within ancient Israelite culture. And trust me, this changes everything about how we understand Genesis. What we're looking at here is... I know the title sounds pretty academic, but stick with me. It's actually pretty fascinating. The theory suggests that the first 5 books of the Bible, including Genesis, weren't written by just one person, like Moses, but by different authors from different time periods. These texts were later stitched together to create what we now call the Torah. Let's break this down. Genesis 1 is typically attributed to what scholars call the P source or priestly source. These guys were all about order, hierarchy, and ritual. Their creation story reflects that. Everything happens in a structured, step-by-step process over 6 days. It's a 6-day process, and it's almost liturgical. It's like a cosmic temple is being built. That's why Genesis 1 feels so formal and distant. It's God as a supreme architect, designing the universe with precise, deliberate actions. But Genesis 2 is a whole different vibe. It's from what's called the J source, Yahweh's source. Yahweh's writers weren't priests, they were storytellers. They weren't as interested in the big cosmic picture as they were in the personal human experience. That's why the God in Genesis 2 feels so much closer and more involved. He's not just speaking things into existence from a distance, he's shaping Adam with his hands, breathing life into him, and walking in the garden. This is a God who's present and interacts directly with humanity. These two sources didn't come from the same time period. The Yahweh tradition, the priestly source, is probably from the early days of the monarchy in Israel, maybe around the time of King David. The Yahwist source is from later, after the Israelites were exiled to Babylon. These are two different versions of Israelite history and belief, written centuries apart. Why does this matter? Because it shows that the Bible wasn't just written in a vacuum. It was shaped by the political, social, and religious circumstances of its time. The priestly writers were living through the Babylonian exile, a traumatic world. The creation story reflects a desire for order in the chaos. It's no wonder their God is so powerful and in control. But the Yahwists had a different world. They focused on the intimate relationship between God and his people because they were in a period of growth. Despite their differences, these two sources were both preserved and woven together into the Genesis we have today. Why? Because they both offered something important. One gave a vision of divine power, the other gave a sense of divine closeness. That's what makes this so radical. The Bible isn't one unified voice, it's a conversation, a debate, even between different groups with different perspectives on who God is and how the world came to be. Alright, let's talk about Adam and Eve, specifically, the strange way they show up in these two different creation accounts. If you've read Genesis 1, you might have noticed something interesting. It says that man and woman are created at the same time, with no mention of Adam or Eve specifically. They're just created together, both in the image of God. It almost feels like a statement of equality. But then we get to Genesis 2, and suddenly the whole story changes. Here, Adam is created first, formed from the dust of the earth, given the breath of life, and placed in the Garden of Eden. Eve doesn't show up until later. How is she made? She was created from Adam's rib, essentially part of him. This isn't just a minor difference in the story. It's a huge shift in how humanity is framed. Genesis 1 almost feels progressive by ancient standards. Both man and woman are made in God's image and created together. But Genesis 2 is a whole different story. In this version, Adam is central. Eve is an afterthought. She was created to solve a problem: Adam's loneliness. Let's not sugarcoat it. This is where a lot of traditional patriarchal views come from. The idea is that woman was created for man. She is secondary. This version of creation has been used for centuries to justify everything from gender roles to societal hierarchies. But should it? Scholars have argued that Genesis 2 was likely written to reflect a more patriarchal worldview that developed later in Israelite society. It wasn't just about telling the story of creation, it was about reinforcing the social structures of the time. By making Adam the story, it sets up a narrative where women are seen as dependent on men, created for men. It's subtle, but it's powerful. This might explain why the two accounts were kept together despite their differences. The priestly account in Genesis 1 could represent an older, possibly more egalitarian tradition. But the Yahwist account in Genesis 2 reflects a society where men were dominant and women's roles were defined by their relationship to men. Now, let's look at something that challenges our usual understanding of the Bible: the order of creation. If you've been following along, the timeline in Genesis 1 is relatively straightforward. God creates the universe in 6 days, with each day's creation following a clear sequence: first the heavens and the earth, then plants, animals, and finally, on day 6, humanity. It's a logical and orderly account. However, when we turn to Genesis 2, the order seems to shift. The order is all over the place in this account. Adam is created first, before any plants or animals. It feels less structured and more reactive. God forms Adam from the ground, then realizes Adam needs food, so he makes plants. Then he notices Adam is lonely, so he creates animals. When that doesn't work out, he finally creates Eve. It's like the creation story went from a perfectly executed plan to a series of on-the-fly decisions. The sudden changes in focus are confusing. Genesis 2 seems to lack the clear structure of Genesis 1. One possible reason is that Genesis 2 is not trying to tell the same kind of story. Genesis 1 is a grand cosmic narrative, focusing on God's creation of the universe with a single word. Genesis 2, on the other hand, is more focused on humanity. Zoomed in, It's all about humanity, specifically about Adam. This story isn't interested in the stars or the galaxies. It's focused on the earth, on the garden, on this one man, and eventually, this one woman. It's like going from the big picture to the personal details. But there's more to it than just a different perspective. The sequence Genesis 2 actually changes the entire dynamic of creation. In Genesis 1, humanity is the climax, the final piece of the puzzle. The world is prepared for us, and we are placed in it. But in Genesis 2, Adam is the starting point. He's the first thing created, and everything else, plants, animals, Eve, exists because of him, for him. It's a totally different way of seeing humanity's role in the world. Instead of being part of creation, Adam becomes the reason for creation. The universe revolves around him. This shift in focus might also hint at something deeper. In ancient cultures, creation stories weren't just about explaining how the world began. They were about defining. Genesis 1 shows us that humans are caretakers of the world, made in the image of God and responsible for the earth. We're still part of the grand scheme of things, though. In Genesis 2, on the other hand, humanity is the center of the story. It's a narrative about control and dominance. Adam is literally formed from the ground. And then everything else is made to suit him. What does that tell us? It suggests that these two stories are coming from very different worldviews. Genesis 1 is about harmony between humanity and creation, while Genesis 2 is about humanity's dominance over creation. And again, these two accounts are sitting right next to each other, and the Bible presents two very different views of creation. One sees us as part of a larger, balanced world, while the other puts us at the center with everything else revolving around us. What's fascinating is that these two stories are presented as if they're on the same page, even though they're clearly not. It's interesting to note that both of these stories have been preserved together for thousands of years, despite offering such different perspectives. Let's take a closer look at something that might completely change the way you view Genesis and the influence of older, ancient creation myths. Here's the thing: the stories in Genesis didn't just appear out of nowhere. They were influenced by other civilizations that existed long before the Bible was written. So, when we look at Genesis, it's important to consider how much of it was influenced by these older myths. Let's start with one of the biggest parallels, the enumeration of days. They didn't just appear out of nowhere. They didn't come from a vacuum. There were other civilizations around ancient Israel, and they had their own creation stories long before the Bible was written. So when we look at Genesis, we need to ask how much of it was influenced by these older myths. Let's start with one of the biggest parallels. The Enummer, the Babylonian creation myth, is pretty wild. In this story, the god Marduk lays a chaos monster named Tiamat and uses her body to create the world. Does that sound familiar? It should, because Genesis 1 starts with God bringing order to the chaos, the formless and void earth, with darkness over the deep waters. The idea of a primeval watery chaos that needs to be tamed is a theme that's shared across many ancient cultures. And the Enummer, the Babylonian creation myth, is centuries older than Genesis. Some scholars believe that Genesis 1 is a response to these older creation myths, especially those from Mesopotamia and Babylon. Instead of multiple gods fighting for control, like in the Enummer, Genesis gives us one God, Elohim, who creates the world with purpose and order, without conflict. But the idea of creating from chaos is similar. Let's talk about the Epic of Atrahasis, another ancient Mesopotamian story. In this one, the gods create humans from clay, and they get this: they do it to relieve the gods from the burden of labor. Humans are made to do the work that gods don't want to do. Now, jump to Genesis 2. God forms Adam from the dust of the ground. Then what does he do? He places Adam in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. It's almost like the Bible took this older theme, the creation of humans, to tend the earth, and adapted it into a more personal story about man's relationship with God. The Garden of Eden itself, it seems to echo another ancient place, Dilmun, which is the paradise from Sumerian mythology. In the Sumerian story, Dilmun is a land where everything is pure, where there's no sickness, no death, and where the gods live in harmony. The parallels to Eden are hard to ignore, as both are places of perfection where the first humans are placed to live in. It seems that the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden is based on an older myth. The biblical writers clearly drew on these stories to create their own version of the story of creation. They took pieces of these ancient myths and reworked them into something new that fit their understanding of God and humanity. Genesis isn't just a standalone creation story. It's part of a larger conversation that was happening in the ancient world about where we come from and what our role is in the universe. Some people get uncomfortable with the idea that the Bible might have Genesis draws on older stories, but that's not a bad thing. It makes the text more interesting. It shows that the biblical writers were engaged with the world around them, responding to the stories and ideas of their time. They weren't just copying, they were redefining what creation meant, what God's relationship to the world looked like. What if the world looked like this? What if Genesis was never meant to be a single, unified story? What if the Bible is intentionally presenting us with multiple beginnings, multiple ways of seeing the world, humanity, and God? We've spent this whole time digging into the differences between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, the contrasting names for God, the different orders of creation. Influences from older myths. But here's the real kicker. Maybe these differences aren't mistakes. Maybe they're the whole point. Why would ancient Israelite scribes include two different creation stories back to back? If they were just trying to give us one straightforward account, they could have easily picked one version and stuck with it, but they didn't. They kept both stories, even though they didn't perfectly line up. And here's why that matters. Genesis isn't just telling us how the world was made. It's inviting us into a conversation about what creation means. In Genesis 1, you've got this God who is all, it's a powerful, authoritative, and orderly account of how the universe came into being. It's grand and awe-inspiring. Genesis 1 gives us a grand, awe-inspiring picture of God creating the universe. Genesis 2, on the other hand, offers a more intimate view of God forming man with his own hands and walking in the garden. These two very different accounts of creation give us glimpses into different aspects of who God is. By including both stories, the Bible is saying that there isn't just one way to understand the divine. It's offering us multiple perspectives because God, creation, and our place in the world are too big and too complex to be captured by just one narrative. This pattern continues throughout the rest of the Bible. We see different voices, different perspectives, and sometimes even different versions of the same story. The Bible isn't afraid of tension or contradiction. It's not about locking us into one single interpretation. It's about inviting us to engage with the text, ask questions, and explore the mystery of God and creation. So, what does this all mean for us? It means that when we read Genesis, we're not just looking for answers. We're engaging with a rich, it's a complex story that challenges us to think in new ways and embrace the divine in unexpected ways. Thanks for sticking around and watching until the end. If you found this discussion as fascinating as we have, please like the video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on the next deep dive into these mind-blowing topics. Thanks again for your support. God bless you all, and we'll see you in the next video.